your own supervised data. There's a growing interest in self-supervised learning these days. It's very hot area these days. The idea is that, again, it's not reinforcement learning, but you can again generate your own supervision yourself. A classic example is that if you want to learn to convert grayscale images into, let's say, color images, like the colorization problem, like these days, I guess there are apps available to do it. They're usually like data-driven and machine learning-driven apps. Because we have got tons of colored images, we can just generate their grayscale counterparts, and then the grayscale counterpart is the input and the output is the colored image. So you don't need to have labeled data, you can self-generate it. And then, of course, this semi-supervised learning, where part of the data set might be labeled, part of the data set might not be labeled, and how to make best use of whatever you have access to in terms of labels. This is like the general overview, but we are going to focus on supervised learning. So for those of you who have taken one of my classes, they would be familiar that some of my favorite examples of supervised learning are about to be shown on the slides. So consider this first example problem. You want to reconstruct the face of a person based upon the input, and the input is in the form of, let's say, a blood sample, skin cells, which of course we shed off all the time. So it's kind of like a crime scene investigation. So the input is DNA sequence, and the desired output is that you want to reconstruct the face of the person from that sample. We'll see how this is a supervised learning problem. Second example, if you have got access to audio signals that come from your car engine, can you do some kind of car diagnostics? For instance, maybe 6 months down the road, you can get a probability that your car will undergo a certain kind of a problem, like, or maybe have certain kind of an engine fault. And then some of the problems which are more related to my own work, like if you have got access to, let's say, like pre-treatment imaging scans from a cancer patient, and the general problem of predicting the response to a particular kind of therapy, whether the person is going to respond to a certain kind of chemotherapy or not. So that's basically called therapy response prediction. So that's also an example of supervised learning. So let's spend a few seconds on discussing that. Why are these problems a machine learning problem to begin with, and how they are just supervised learning problems. So first of all, one common thread across these example problems is that we do not know the exact relationship between the input and the output. So we have got the input for, in this case, the first case, a DNA sequence, car audio, and an MRI image scan. We do not know precisely like any equation or maybe set of rules, because if that was the case, we would just encode that equation. We would still have to write a piece of code, but we would just write it and solve the problem. So as most of you would be familiar that, of course, the idea of learning or machine learning that begins to come into play when, of course, these precise equations and relationships are not known. And of course, if you are dealing with a problem where you know the precise equation, don't go for machine learning. Just implement the precise input-output relationship. The second common thread is that we can actually collect data, which means that we can have lots of input-output pairs. For instance, we can have lots of examples. We can recruit a group of people, collect their blood samples, sequence their DNA, and of course, take their picture as well. And we can do this for 1,000 people, 10,000 people. So we'll have input-output pairs. Again, you can record the car engine sound like yourself, ask your friends, and collect multiple samples, and then wait for however many months that you want to wait, maybe 6 months, and then just follow up and make a record of what kind of problems you experienced in that period of time. Again, you have generated input-output pairs. Exactly similar thing, you can capture pre-treatment imaging scans. Before you start the treatment, you expose the person to a particular kind of treatment, and then you just follow up and figure out whether the person responded to that treatment or not. So that's the common thread. And that's why you can learn, you can hope to learn the input-output relationship from these examples. And that's why they're all examples and instances of supervised machine learning. Just a side note, when we talk about supervised machine learning, usually we talk in the context of a regression problem or a classification problem. A regression problem is a situation where your output is continuous, and a classification problem is the situation where your output is categorical. So in the first case, where you were asked to just predict the image of the face of a person, that was a regression problem. The rest of the two problems were classification. So general pipeline in supervised learning setup, how do we train machine learning models? Of course, the first step is that you collect your data set or maybe download it from the web. And then the usual practice is that you divide your data set into, let's say, 3 partitions. So in the first partition, like I'm going to call it like the training set, and that's the partition on the basis of which you learn your actual machine learning model. That model could be anything. Right now, I'm just talking agnostic to the kind of the model. It could be a neural network, or it could be a classical decision tree. Then we have got a validation set, and you train the model on this training set. And then if you want to tune certain parameters, fine tune your parameters, you can use this validation set to do a little bit of cheating and retune the setting of your model. But then the actual, for example, if you're writing a paper, the actual results that you report, they're supposed to be on a totally unseen partition of the data set, which your algorithm has not seen during learning the model, and not even during tuning the parameters of the model. And that's called the test set. So if another option is that if we have got smaller data sets, you can do something which is known as cross-validation. And in that case, you still end up dividing your data set into partitions. Usually those partitions are referred to as folds. And you cycle through multiple iterations such that in each iteration, you select one of the folds and call it the test set, and you use the rest of the folds for training the model. For instance, in the first case, you will just leave this fold 1 out, and usually this is how it is referred to, leave one fold out. And you use the rest of the 2 folds or partitions to train your model on, and then test it on fold 1. As a consequence, if you do it for all the possibilities, all the examples end up featuring in your test set. And this is just a way of increasing your confidence, because if you've got a smaller data set, you don't have to make a decision that, okay, I'm going to use only 10% as test set. So every example is being tested on, and if from fold to fold, the performance is more or less comparable, that's a good sign. If it's very erratic, that's not a good sign. Maybe the good performance that you're getting is just a coincidence. So that's about that. That's all I wanted to talk about supervised learning, and this is all good. However, like these days, we increasingly come across situations where we are dealing with multiple data sets at the same point in time. So for a single data set, that's the sunny day scenario that we just discussed. We can just divide it into training versus testing. We can do cross-validation, or we could do hyperparameter tuning using the training, validation, and test partitioning. For instance, we could have access to data sets from multiple sites, like maybe imaging studies from multiple hospitals. Um, and they study basically the same condition, for example, the same diseases. And of course, the objective is to like try to learn a model that can like classify these diseases. But of course, these images are coming from different sources. Or like this is a well-known set of data sets for brain MRI scans, and basically they're used to classify the cognitive health of a person. So this is like a famous initiative, the Alzheimer's Disease Neuroimaging Initiative. It actually has got three data sets within this, the umbrella of this ADNI data set, and then a data set emerging from an Australian group. And again, here the problem is that can we try to make the best use of data from multiple sites? Because at the end of the day, they are studying the same physical phenomena, or they're trying to predict the similar output variable. Maybe you want to learn a model on two of the data sets and then try to test it on the third data set to figure out if your model has learned something intrinsic to the condition, or is it just learning some specific details of a particular data set? And that brings us to the question of cross data set generalization, and we are getting closer to introducing what data set bias is. So suppose in the context of that chest X-ray study, if we train a model on, let's say, the first data set that comes from NIH, and we do all the hard work, we divide the data set into 3 partitions, we tune the parameters of the model using a validation set, and then we report results on the test set, which we have not seen during the training, and we're getting good performance. So that's good. Perhaps you could just write a paper and declare victory. However, if you now test that same model on, let's say, images from another source, maybe from Mount Sinai Hospital, and suddenly if your model performance goes down or starts behaving in a totally erratic way and starts producing noisy output, obviously, of course, first of all, we are not getting any cross data set generalization. And in the first place, the performance that we were getting on NIH, we should also be suspicious of that performance. Maybe that was just a coincidence. So that should raise a red flag, that maybe the model that we learned in the first place, it has learned something totally frivolous, not necessarily related to the intrinsic underlying condition. And that's because of the biases that just creep in inadvertently in different data sets. Different data sets differ from each other. And there is a long history of collecting data sets in computer vision community. And just for historical perspective, so even way back in 1990s and early 2000s, so this was the norm. So people would collect a data set, then of course, and the objective would be to learn models that can recognize objects in computer vision. And of course, a rat race would begin amongst researchers, and they would compete with each other, and very soon they would just saturate that particular data set. And then somebody would just come up and write a paper that there are so many deficiencies in this data set. This is too simplistic, or maybe like a toy data set. So let's try to increase the variability in our data. Let's collect a new data set. And of course, the models that were trained on earlier data sets, they would not generalize on the new data set. And this cycle would keep repeating over and over again. And there was increasing suspicion, like whatever the computer vision community is doing is just like a never-ending kind of a race For instance, if there was a model that was trained to detect the presence of a car in an image, and if the data set only had seen images from sports cars, then probably it was not learning the general concept of a car. So it was just like overfitting to the idiosyncrasies of a particular kind of a car. So way back in 2011, so this is actually one of the seminal papers in dataset bias. And this, for the first time, investigated the problem in a more or less more principled fashion, and figured out that how to quantify the idiosyncrasies of a data set. And they actually proposed a very clever method. So they were playing a game which they named as Name the Dataset game. And the idea was that if there are differences among data sets, and every data set had, let's say, a signature footprint of itself, then it should be very easy to learn a classifier that would detect the data set membership. So forget about the actual variable of interest that we are trying to predict. So forget about the fact that we are trying to make a car detector or a face detector or whatever. So let's try to learn a classifier that can just try to detect the dataset membership. And what they started noticing, so one of the earliest data sets, this was the so-called Caltech 101 cars. So here, it was obvious that all the cars were captured from, the images of the cars were captured from the side pose. In one data set, there were only sports cars. And what they figured out, that it was almost trivial to learn this classifier. So this Name the Dataset game, they had access to about 12 visual data sets. So they learned a 12 class dataset membership classifier. And what they showed was this, that their performance was like much better than chance. As a function of the training examples. For example, in this graph, the x-axis is the number of training examples. As you can see, for different methods, the classification performance kept on increasing as you kept on increasing the number of training examples. And this was a 12 class problem. So the chance performance would be 1 upon 12, around like 8%. And every method actually performed much better than chance. So of course, that was a red flag. So as a consequence, there was some effort in terms of categorizing the kinds of the biases that you can experience. These are pretty straightforward, but just for the sake of completeness, of course, in different data sets, you can have different kinds of selection biases. Even if you are collecting images for the same kind of object, maybe you collect it directly from the internet, and or maybe you are more predisposed to just capturing images from the street because it's more convenient for you. And of course, that all depends on what we're trying to study. Then very important kind of bias, the so-called capture bias or the acquisition bias. Your imaging device can vary. If you're measuring signals, you're there can be sensor variability. In the context of medical imaging, of course, there is variability when it comes to images from different vendors. Another kind of bias is the so-called labeling bias, because at the end of the day, these annotations and labels are coming from human labelers. And of course, people can assign very different labels to the same kind of object. And of course, in the context of medical imaging, the problems are compounded. For instance, if a radiologist is reporting on the basis of a CT scan or an MRI imaging volume, and these are volumes, 3D scans, sometimes they scroll through the entire volume, like slice by slice, and maybe just pick one representative slice. And how they pick one representative slice varies from physician to physician. And so what kind of labels that they assign could change from person to person. Another very tricky kind of bias is the so-called negative set bias. And it is very tricky for the following reason. So again, if I want to build a car detector, of course, I want to have access to examples of car images, but I also need to have examples of what is not a car. And for that, anything is game. So anything that is not a car is basically not a car. So, which means that potentially for negative examples, which are not a particular object of interest, we have got infinitely many possibilities. And when data sets are being built, different people or different groups might select different examples or different kinds of objects that specify the negative class in the context of the class of interest. So this is actually very tricky kind of bias. And of course, I'm not going to spend too much time on this. I think you already got the intuition that what are the factors that should raise a red flag. Of course, if we are able to detect a dataset membership, if you are able to learn a dataset membership classifier, that should raise a red flag, and if it is performing better than chance. If you want to assess cross dataset generalization, and within dataset performance is super, but the moment you move to a different dataset, if it drops, of course, that's a red flag. So these are the two basic measures of assessing whether there is bias or not. So I think now we are just beginning the business end of the talk. So I would highly encourage, if you are interested in the topic, to go through some of the older papers to get a perspective on the topic, how people have been handling this issue of dataset bias. But of course, for today, we are going to discuss this paper. And of course, this is the reason why the talk was the talk's title was the same as the paper's title. So let me tell you what was the inspiration behind this method. And there is a growing field in AI, which is called as AI for fairness, or sometimes called as fair machine learning. They're dedicated conferences only for fair machine learning. And these are basically methods which are built usually for these kinds of problems. For instance, if somebody is screening CVs or offering bank loan, or maybe offering insurance rates, or of course considering students for admission, of course we would like in the ideal scenario, we would like to make sure that these decisions are not dependent on some this so-called protected or sensitive information. For example, you should not be making this decision on the basis of somebody's race, sex, or gender, and so on and so forth. So, which means that, of course, you should, and if you're building an automated method, inadvertently, it should not try to focus on these kinds of variables. For example, you received 10,000 CVs and you wanted to shortlist into a list of 50 CVs. And if it had just filtered on the basis of race, of course, this was not a good algorithm. So this is all this AI for fairness campaign, and of course, it's a growing area. So a naive solution in this case would be we just blank out these protected attributes. The problem with this blind solution is that whatever is left may still be correlated with the protected variable. Maybe you have blanked out the race of a person, but maybe there is some other attribute which is not race per se, but you can still figure out what the race of a person is, although that is blanked out. So this naive anonymization, it actually doesn't work. Usually doesn't work. You can still infer the protected variables. Again, Along these lines, this is one of the seminal papers. This is so-called the Learning Fair Representation from Rich Zemmel. He's at U of T. And the idea basically is that you want to transform your input to some representation such that from that, in that space, it's very difficult to infer the protected variable. And of course, you just want to lose just enough information. You don't want to lose everything. So you want to try to preserve as much information as is possible. Okay. So that's the idea. And it's the whole solution outline for the problem of dataset bias is just one step away from it, because you can just consider dataset membership in this context. You just have to identify and recognize this link. This is an interesting link because there is a body of work for like in AI for fairness and for fair machine learning. So if you just consider in our context, if dataset membership is that protected or sensitive variable. So the whole idea here is this, that let's suppose we have got data from different data sets, and this is our raw feature space. It could be images or it could be non-imaging data. And from in this raw space, of course, we can do dataset membership inference, and we can also do classification use like for our variable of interest, but we want to do something to our raw feature space. And that something is basically the heart of the method. And I'm going to call that like you just want to like unlearn the dataset membership. And what should happen in this transform space or latent representation, it should be very difficult to make this inference now. You should not be able to tell dataset membership, but at the same time, you should still be able to do classification or do whatever task that you're interested in. Okay. So that's the general solution outline. So let's define some notation very quickly. So let's suppose we have got data points from multiple data sets. Each data point x sub little m is represented by some n numbers, so it's in an n-dimensional space. So we have got d data sets. Maybe we can use the letter S to just represent the dataset membership, and that's just a number between 1 and d because they're d data sets. And as far as our variable of interest goes, maybe it's a classification problem, and the number of classes for the variable of interest are C. And of course, we have got access to the ground truth labels, and that's our objective, to learn models that can basically learn to predict this class membership. And let's say our input X is transformed through some transformation, and the output is this latent representation. We'll call that as psi. There are many choices for this transformation. Maybe you can model it by neural network, but in this paper, I basically took a more like an explicit, like a modeling approach, like starting from first principles, that what is it that we are looking for in that transform space. So let's spend a few minutes that what is it that we are looking for? What are the desired properties of the latent space? Of course, we want to have the notion of like unlearning or forgetting the dataset membership. And what it actually means is, if I rephrase this sentence over here, is that if I tell you, if I share with you this latent representation psi, and I don't share X with you, you should not be able to like process psi through any like any mechanism, any transformation to figure out what's the dataset membership. Okay, so dataset membership should just be lost as you move from X to psi. So that's the property that we are looking for. So again, there are many choices, as I mentioned, and the reason for this particular choice, and of course you can propose a different representation for the latent space, but the reason is going to be evident in the next minute. So for the time being, just bear with me. So let's suppose that I'm going to use this psi, which is just a collection of k numbers. So that's why it's like a k-dimensional representation. And what it represents is that it represents a membership probability to a cluster. And there are k clusters. So you would be wondering at this time suddenly where these clusters are coming from. But imagine that there are some clusters which are specified by their centers. Of course, a cluster is usually specified by its center. And there are k such clusters. And this is the representation. And that representation is that what's the probability that my input belongs to that cluster? And of course, because there are capital K such clusters, I will have capital K such numbers. So the whole idea is that if I tell you this cluster membership now, so that's my new representation, latent representation. If I share with you this information about cluster membership, that should not allow you to infer dataset membership. And what it actually means is that the proportion of examples from different data sets in every cluster should be more or less the same. Because then you would not be able to guess which data set an input is coming from. So visually, if let's suppose I've got K clusters, and let's suppose these colored dots represent examples from different studies or different data sets. And if you notice each of these clusters, the number of data points from each data set, they're more or less the same. Even if I tell you that, okay, for a particular data point, K is equal to 2, which means that I'm telling you that it belongs to the second cluster. It's almost indistinguishable in terms of its proportion. So you should not be able to tell where, like, which study or which data set the example is coming from. So that's the basic intuition. And we'll just very quickly formulate it mathematically. So if we go with this model, then of course the entire problem is that we want to figure out cluster centers, because the location of these clusters is specified by the cluster centers. So the choice is in terms of the centers of the cluster. And let's suppose the cluster center are still going to be points in the original space, and the original space is n-dimensional. And we have got k such cluster centers. So let's call them as V sub k, where V sub k itself is a point in the original raw feature space. And there are many choices to, like, in terms of the probability membership, in terms of course, these cluster centers. One popular choice is that, of course, we want to make sure that points which are very far off from a cluster center, they are assigned a smaller number, and which are closer to the cluster center, they should be assigned a larger number. So the numerator takes care of that. And because we want to interpret these numbers as probability, we have to normalize so that they sum up to 1. And of course, they are going to be positive numbers because they are exponentials. So just for like simplicity, let's define another variable, which is going to be like a number from 1 to k, and the probability that a particular example belongs to cluster k is going to be just the probability that that variable takes on the value k. It's just like for simplification. Now, having framed the problem so far, the entire enterprise of unlearning dataset membership is to learn the cluster center such that something happens. And that something is that if I tell you the value of z, which means that I'm telling you that this point belongs to cluster k, because you should be unable to make any inference about the dataset membership, and S is the variable that we are using in this case to represent dataset membership. So this distribution, this conditional distribution, should ideally be a uniform distribution, which means that it should be as random as possible. Because if it's not random, if it is lopsided, I can start making inferences about what S is. So it should not tell you anything about S. And that actually means that it should be as uniform as possible. And our actual objective is just one step away from it. If you want to make a distribution as uniform as possible, what's the mathematical construct? We want to make it as random as possible, which means that we want to make the entropy of this variable S conditioned upon Z equals K as large as possible. So we want to make the entropy of S, and we want to do it for all the cluster centers, for all the clusters. But what is it that we are optimizing with respect to? We are optimizing with respect to the choice of the cluster centers. So we want to maximize this entropy with respect to the choice of cluster centers. And of course, this maximization problem can be written as minimization problem, negative of that. Usually that's what we usually do. You can maximize anything, or you can minimize a loss, or you can maximize an objective. So we want to frame it as a loss minimization problem. And what is the entropy? So entropy of any variable, because this is conditioned upon, so this is the expected value of the negative expected value of the log of that conditional probability. Usually the base of the log is 2, but like if it's consistent, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. So this part for all k is basically our bias unlearning loss. And what is it a function of? Of course, it's a function of our data, x, and secondly, it's a function of the cluster centers. Data is known, cluster centers are of course unknown, and that's why we want to minimize this loss with respect to the choice of cluster centers. So that should take care of this first part, that data set membership inference is not possible. But we also want to make sure that at the same point in time, the class is also detectable. So I'm not going to go into that much detail, but in that latent space, you can always formulate a classification loss. Maybe you can keep it as simple as possible. You can try to learn a linear classifier, which is parameterized by a set of like numbers, like or weight vectors W. It could be a logistic regression classifier, which is the simplest classifier. And therefore, the classification loss is going to be a function, of course, the data. Of course, is a function of the weight parameters. It is also a function of the cluster centers. Why? Because this classification is in this psi space, and psi is dependent on the choice of these cluster centers. There's one last thing, and then our problem would be finished. So as I mentioned in the beginning, that we want to lose just enough information, not all the information. Because, for instance, if I try to learn a transformation without paying heed to this aspect of like keeping a constraint on top of how much information do I want to lose, if I map every data point, let's say to all zeros or to a constant, so everything maps to a constant value. Of course, I've unlearned dataset membership, but I have like lost every other aspect of the attributes, all other attributes in the data set as well. So we need to make sure that we should just penalize how much information is being lost. And one way is to impose this constraint, the ability to reconstruct the data point back from this psi representation of the cluster centers. So these cluster centers are in the original space. Psi is just a probability. So how about we define this reconstructed version as a weighted sum of the cluster centers? Again, this is a choice. And then this is the reconstruction loss, and we can just compute this loss for all the training examples. And then our the overall problem is basically the minimization with respect to the classification weights and the cluster centers, and a combination of these three losses. And this is very general. Of course, you need some tweaking around to like how much you want to like how much penalty that you want to associate with each kind of the loss. So very quickly, so how am I doing with the time, Dr. Figley?
I think you have another probably 5 or so minutes, because I'd like to leave some time for questions.
Sure.
5 to 7 minutes, I'd say.
Okay, sure. So we have covered the theory, and I'll just quickly go through an example problem, and that's going to be on that data set that I introduced in the beginning for classifying the cognitive status. So basically, these are 4 data sets, which are primarily imaging data, and they're basically T1 weighted brain MRI images. There are 3 data sets that come from this initiative, captured at different points in time, and 1 data set from this Australian group. And the features that we use, again, this is a non-deep version that we have so far covered. This is from first principles. I never mentioned a deep neural network. So these are very standard features that are used, are like the anatomical atlas of certain brain regions of interest. And the actual features are basically the cortical surface measures, and they have been known to be associated with the cognitive status. First of all, is there bias in this collection of data sets? So the first experiment was based on these features, you try to learn a data set classifier. And sure enough, there's different data sets presented different kind of ease with which they could be distinguished. For example, this first data set, it gave like 80% detection performance. This partition was the most difficult one. But in general, overall, we were getting an average classification of about 66%, which is of course way better than chance if it's a 4-class problem. So that's a red flag. So there is some like indication that the collection of these data sets is basically somehow biased, although they are trying to study the same variable of interest, try to balance the population groups as well. So very quickly, some of the results based on the method that I mentioned. And so there are 3 methods that I'm going to compare. Of course, the blue is what we discussed. This orange is at the time was a baseline method for undoing dataset bias. That's basically an unbiased SVM. That's a very interesting paper. It's pretty dated, but I think it's interesting to just get a hang of the problem. So I recommend that if you want to read this paper. And this gold represents the naively one data set out. We do nothing. So we learn model on the basis of, let's say, all the data sets and test it on the left out data set. And as it turns out, so although the improvement in each case was different, in the case of this AIBL data set, both of these methods performed very bad, and somehow our method was performing very good. Here it was like a marginal improvement in terms of the area under the curve of the RRC, because it's a 2-class problem of distinguishing between MCI, mild cognitive impairment, versus normal. More interestingly, you can also have another performance metric. Remember in the beginning, I mentioned that you can have within data set performance, and then you can keep track of the percentage drop in whatever performance metric that you're using. Here we have the AUC, as you move from within data set to across data set. So the performance drop for this particular case remained below the rest of the methods. I would just mention it was a first hack, and these numbers on the face of it are not very good numbers, I would say, and there is a lot of room for improvement. But the problem is that just compare it with like the naively one data set out. You combine all other data sets and test on the left out data set. That doesn't work at all. That gives like almost like a chance performance. Like an AUC of 0.5 is the chance. So that's the nature of the problem. So I'm just going to very quickly conclude with some of the deep extensions. There's a lot of interest these days in adversarial neural networks. So these kinds of problems to handle dataset bias, usually they are solved by learning three different neural networks together. So one neural network is responsible for transforming the input to that latent space. One neural network is responsible for doing the classification for the dataset membership, and the other one is responsible for doing the actual classification with respect to the variable of interest. And why they're called adversarial neural networks? Because the data classification network is actually competing with the other representation transformation network. And the goal is that the parameters of the representation network, neural network, should be changed in a way such that the best performing dataset classification network performs as bad as possible. So you're trying to make life as difficult as possible for the dataset classification network. The dataset classification network runs its own local optimization to be as good as possible on dataset classification tasks. And you want to make sure that its best case scenario is as bad as possible. So that's why it's called adversarial. They're competing with each other. And one of my master students, Najme Safar, is actually working on a variant of the above problem these days. So in summary, of course, we have figured out that we can assess dataset bias, the presence of dataset bias, if you're dealing with a collection of multiple studies or data sets, by analyzing cross dataset generalization, by trying to learn a dataset membership classifier. We talked about the different kinds of bias, the selection bias, acquisition bias, and the tricky bias negative set, as I mentioned. And then we have this general solution outline, and it can have different incarnations. You can take a very simple approach that you can like code yourself, or you can take a deep approach to it, like a deep neural network to this approach. But this is the general outline. The general outline is kind of adversarial because you want something to happen in one case and something not to happen in the other case. So the nature of this outline is adversarial to begin with. And the problem of dataset bias creeps in almost every biomedical context. We talked primarily in the context of biomedical imaging, but if you're dealing with biomedical signal processing, you're dealing with multi-channel sensor readouts and different sensors. It doesn't have to be a data collected from different institutes or sites. You may be collecting the data from the same site, but there is a lot of sensor variability. And then, of course, in genomic data, we have got lots of like publicly available genomic data in different data banks. And that's a huge can of worms, like in and of itself in terms of the data set bias. And because although there's lots of standardization, but it turns out that like based upon my conversation with my colleagues working in computational biology and bioinformatics, even this high throughput sequencing data, there's a lot of variability. So these kinds of methods will come in handy, I believe, in a variety of contexts. So I'm going to stop now and look forward to your questions.
Okay, well, that's wonderful. Thank you for the interesting talk. I have a few ideas that that I'd like to ask you about maybe offline, but if anybody else has questions for Dr. Ashraf right now, please unmute your microphone and turn on your camera if possible. And we do have some time for questions.
Hello, Dr. Ashraf. Can you hear me?
I can hear you very well.
Yeah, really, it's a nice presentation. I think I just have some few basic sort of question. Is that actually how are you understanding that which terms of bias you are having for different data sets? So, for example, you have a car data set with like normalized car, and say for example, I do have a data set which have like futuristic or maybe concept cars. So how are you actually differentiating the biases actually? And is there any kind of parameter on the bias? So say for example, this is more biased data set and maybe these are less biased. And depending on that one, can we actually try to implement any kind of algorithms to generalize them?
Cool, good question. So, you know what? I might have to introduce uh, the concept of attention. For those of you who are not familiar with this concept of attention in neural networks, is just a way of figuring out, let's say, what parts of the input are contributing to a particular decision. Okay. For instance, in the case of an image, if let's suppose the output of the neural network is car, so you these attention modules in modern day neural networks, they basically tell you what is it that the network is looking at that is making the network to like go ahead with that decision. So there is some work to interpret the dataset bias using attention networks. For instance, the classifier that um, learns the dataset membership. So you can actually visualize that classifier using attention networks and maybe figure out, for instance, if there's a possibility, if the classifier is overfitting and taking the training data too seriously, let's say it just sees one brand of cars, like a Honda cars, and if there is attention visualization around, let's say, the logo of the car, that's perhaps not good because it would fail big time if it's a Volkswagen. Okay. Whereas if it is focusing on, let's say, more general, maybe a grill, maybe headlights, maybe wheels, so on, the more general, which might appear in any car, then you will figure that out where the bias is coming from. So, but this is a huge field in and of itself.
Just sum it up. I mean, it is kind of different from different domain of problem. I mean, if you're working with car images, then it's different. If you're working with, say, for example, like brain images, maybe the biasing and all other parameters may be slightly different.
Yeah, the biases could be different, but this attention network, attention-based investigation of the bias is still pretty general. You would still use an attention neural network on brain images as well. The output could vary.
Thank you.
Uh-huh.
Okay, I think there's a question that came up, or maybe a couple of questions in the chat. So first is Shangal Hader. Do you have a microphone? If not, I can read it out potentially in case anybody else is called in. Okay, so very briefly, I'll just read it out. So the question is, while encountering the overfitting problem, we try to generalize our model for other data sets also, not for one particular data set. So how much effective techniques like regularization, dropout, weight constraint, etc., which are used for solving overfitting against data set bias, and how will we differentiate between overfitting and data set bias problems?
Cool. I think you can figure that out. If your data set classification, again, you go back to that, like your very first test of assessing the bias. And in your data set classification, you used all kinds of regularization. And even then, you are able to detect the data set membership. And usually, if there is bias, these simple kinds of regularization in practice do not work, because it's not just the, usually these kinds of regularization work in terms of compensating for the scale of the features. But if the data in and of itself is very different, and we want to transform it to a domain such that they become as similar as possible with respect to the variable of interest, if they share it, you usually have to learn another neural network on top of it that takes care of that transformation. But you can find that out very quickly by assessing your cross dataset generalization performance, like empirically, by tweaking around the regularization. Sure, if regularization is taking care of it, go ahead with it. But if there is bias, generally it will give a hard time, and it won't just go away based upon these standard regularization techniques.
Okay, and then maybe there's time for just one more question. I think Shangal had asked one more, but I would say if there's anybody else that has a question, you can go ahead and turn on your microphone and ask it. Oh, otherwise there is another one that showed up in the chat from Sarah. So I don't have a microphone, but would like to ask about the idea of sequential ensemble learning, where transfer learning is sequentially moved from one data set to the other one.
Sure, that could be done, and that has been done before. And that's, if you're interested in that body of work, look up the keywords domain adaptation, where you, of course, learn one model on one data set and initialize the model parameters from that point, and basically learn another model on top of it. It's a little bit tricky. That's a good baseline. Usually in dataset bias, people use that as a baseline, and the model, the methods which are specifically designed to handle dataset bias, they usually are able to outperform this. But this is an interesting approach. The problem here is that this might be dependent on the sequence of the data sets, which data set you choose to train your model on for the first time. So it's again a tricky aspect, but you can keep doing it over and over again, and sometimes it gives like practical good, like results. So that's not a bad baseline to begin with.
Okay, we're already slightly over time. I see that there are more questions coming in through the chat, and I realize that other people might have questions as well. But I think because it is after 5 o'clock, I will end the formal parts. So anybody who has to run is welcome to leave. I think I'll maybe ask if Dr. Ashraf could stay on for one more question. For anybody who's interested in staying, you're welcome to do so. Dr. Ashraf, do you have another couple of minutes?
Sure.
Okay. So the next question is, do you have a preference to choose the optimization method? Also, did you happen to compare different optimization methods to get a better result?
So by and large, the kind of the optimization methods that we are dealing with are basically gradient-based methods. Within gradient-based methods, if you have taken my course, I don't remember, there is a zoo of gradient-based methods. I know there are non-gradient-based methods as well, which are evolutionary methods or like genetic methods. Of course, I usually do not. I used to use those methods long time ago, but these days I do not for the last many years. So I cannot comment on that. There are other methods called, you refer to as simulated annealing. I also don't use those these days, so I cannot comment on that. But amongst the gradient-based methods, by the way, the objective function that we formulated is perfectly differentiable with respect to the cluster centers and, of course, the weight parameters. Amongst the gradient-based methods, this was plain vanilla stochastic gradient descent. It didn't even use the usual deep learning framework-based gradient methods. I'm sure you're familiar with the Adam optimization method and the RMS prop methods. Usually those methods are momentum-based methods. They keep track of gradient updates from previous iterations and make sure that you're not stuck in local minima. So this is just the vanilla version of stochastic gradient descent. And of course, I did not make any comparison. So, but this is a good point. I think this is food for thought for, I believe, Najme, who is not, I can't see here. No, I can see her. Okay.
Okay, I guess just before we wrap up, the last question, I see a couple of people have asked in the group chat, and at least 3 or 4 other people have private chatted to me, wondering if it might be possible to get a copy of the slides.
Sure.
Dr. Ashraf, would you be willing to share the slides?
Sure. Should I just email it to you?
If you wouldn't mind emailing it to me, that would be great. And then anybody who would like a copy should have my email address. So feel free to email me by tomorrow, and I will send out an email to everybody who would like them by the end of the day tomorrow. Okay, and then I realize there are maybe 1 or 2 questions that we didn't have time to answer here. I would say also, if anybody has additional questions or would like to chat offline, I'm going to speak for him. Dr. Ashraf is generally quite approachable, I would say. So feel free to email him any specific questions. I think that was a very interesting talk. I think it's something that we will probably encounter more and more actually going forward in terms of machine learning. So I think it was an excellent primer on that, and some things in interesting directions that I hadn't thought about before in terms of where some of the field is going in that. So thanks again for a terrific talk. I would like to thank everybody again for joining us for the 2020 BME seminar series. Have a good holiday. Hopefully everybody can relax and stay safe and come back refreshed, and we will see you all in 2021. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks.
Thank you. Have a good break. Bye-bye.
Thank you, Chase. And Dr. Ashraf, do I have your permission to post your lecture on the YouTube online?
Sure. I'm fine with that. Sure, go ahead.
No problem. Okay. Because I did record, and we normally post it online available from the BME webpage. Thank you very much for your very interesting lecture.
Thank you. See you then.
Yeah.
Bye, everyone. Stay safe.
Take care. Bye.
Bye.